In this video, we discuss Virginia Woolf and a few of her works. Virginia Woolf was the foremost modernist of the 20th century. And she was also a novelist who started the Stream of Consciousness novels. Stream of Consciousness novels are novels with interior monologue. In such a novel, there will be the depiction of the multitudinous of thoughts and feelings that pass through the mind of the characters. The term Stream of Consciousness novels was coined by William James, the brother of Henry James. Henry James, as we know, is a popular British-American novelist who started the realistic genre of novels in American literature as well as in the British literature. And his brother William James was the founder of the term Stream of Consciousness novels. And it appeared in his book, The Principles of Psychology. And there are many Stream of Consciousness novelists like James Joyce, D.S. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, Richard Strachey, and Dorothy Richardson. And Dorothy Richardson's collection of 13 novels entitled Pilgrimage is considered as the first complete Stream of Consciousness novels. Stream of Consciousness novels was a byproduct of the avant-garde movement that started in France. Avant-garde refers to advanced gods. And the writers produced the experimental, radical and unorthodox novels. And avant-garde was the hallmark of modernism. Avant-garde was actually a byproduct of the Dadaist movement that originated in Europe. It was the anarchist art started in Zurich. Virginia Woolf was one of the co-founders of the Stream of Consciousness novels in English literature. And one among the popular novelists who belonged to the Stream of Consciousness genre was James Joyce. And there are many similarities between James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. Both were born in the same year and died in the same year. Virginia and James Joyce were born in 1882 and died in 1941 at the age of 59. James Joyce died due to natural causes, whereas Virginia became dead by committing suicide. And Virginia committed suicide in 1941 at the age of 59, having filled in her jacket with stones and by jumping into the river and drowning herself. And her body was also recovered later. And she was also an influential member of the Bloomsbury group of intellectuals. And her most famous works include novels like Voyage Out, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, and a few biographies like Orlando, Flush. And she also produced a play and a few of the essays also. And her most popular book-length essay is A Room of One's Own. And it contains the dictum, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she wants to write a novel. If she is to write fiction, she wants a room of her own and money. and it is considered as the Bible of the feminist ideology. I told you that Virginia Woolf suffered from bouts of mental illness throughout her career, and it can be defined as bipolar disorder. And this made her commit suicide, and she tried to commit suicide several times, and finally she committed suicide in 1941. And she was born as the third child of Leslie Stephen, a Victorian man of letters, and his second wife, Julia Duckworth, who served as a model to pre-Raphaelite painters like Rossetti. Leslie Stephen had formerly married Marian Thackeray, the daughter of William Makepeace Thackeray, and this makes Virginia Woolf the granddaughter of William Makepeace Thackeray. As Leslie Stephen was a prominent writer, his house was often visited by writers like Henry James, Henry Lewis, who was the husband of George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, and James Russell Lowell, who was an American romantic poet. And Virginia was brought up in such a literary atmosphere, reading voraciously from her father's library. And the boys were sent to the universities, but the girls were not permitted to study at the distant university. And it was the first time Virginia Woolf challenged the family attitude. The sudden death of her mother when Virginia was only 13 led to the first nervous breakdown. Later, Virginia joined King's College, London, for her degree, and came into contact with women reformers like Gillian Faithfull and Clara Peter, the sister of Walter Pater. And the death of her father in 1904 provoked her most alarming collapse, and she was even briefly institutionalized. Though often affected by mental disorder, she continued her literary activity. And after the death of her father, the family settled at Bloomsbury, and Virginia came to have connection with Lytton Strachey, Clive Bell, Rupert Brooke, Duncan Grant, Leonard Woolf, John Keynes Maynard, and others. And these connections made it to form the Bloomsbury Group. And the Bloomsbury group of writers included Leonard and Virginia Woolf. They got married also. Vanessa and Clive Bell, they also got married. Vanessa was the sister of Virginia. And there was Lytton Strachey, there was Roger Fry, David Grant, Duncan Grant, David Garnett, John Maynard Keynes, Molly and Desmond McCarthy, E.M. Foster, Sidney Saxon, Turner, and Adrian Stephen. Virginia, I told you, was married to Leonard Woolf in 1912. And the couple collaborated professionally, founding the Hogarth Press in 1917. And after establishing Hogarth Press, they brought out a volume of stories called Two Stories. One story was contributed by Virginia, and the other was written by Leonard Woolf. And Virginia's story was called The Mark on the Wall. And they brought out many volumes, including the volumes of Catherine Mansfield's collection of stories called Prelude. And they also brought out T.S. Eliot's Wasteland in 1923. T.S. Eliot actually brought out The Wasteland in 1922, and the year inaugurated the beginning of the modern age. And he brought out The Wasteland in his periodical called Criterion. He started a periodical called Criterion with the intention of bringing out his works. And he brought out the poem Wasteland through the Criterion. And in 1922, Wasteland was published in the American magazine The Dial. In 1923, Virginia Woolf produced The Wasteland through her press, Hogarth. And when James Joyce approached her for publishing his novel The Ulysses, Virginia avoided it. She didn't consider the novel as a great literary work, and she recommended that. She remarked that the novel was a misfire. Even though she remarked the novel as misfire and didn't publish the novel became very popular, and so many number of volumes of the novel was produced also. And Virginia came out with her first novel called The Voyage Out in 1915. And it was her first novel titled The Voyage Out. And the central character is Rachel Winrace. She is modeled on Virginia Woolf. She embarks on a course of discovery. It's like a kind of modern mythical voyage. She is an introvert and interested in keeping herself in the home. But her aunt takes her for a sea voyage. And during the voyage, she falls in love with a young man named Terence. But unfortunately, she becomes dead. And the story is the story of her voyage out. So her getting into the open world, the world of freedom. And it can be defined as Virginia's voyage to freedom, to the beginning of the Bloomsbury Group. And her next novel was Night and Day. And it was the longest novel produced by Virginia. And the novel is dedicated to her sister, Vanessa Bell. And Vanessa Bell has been produced in the novel as one of the important of characters. And it contrasts the daily lives and romantic attachments of two acquaintances, Catherine Hilberry and Mary Datchett. Catherine Hilberry engaged to William Rodney, but the engagement becomes broken. And at a later stage, Catherine agrees to marry Ralph Denham, a lawyer who writes articles for journals. But Ralph Denham was already in love with another lady named Mary Datchett. But the lady sacrifices her love and permits Catherine marry Ralph Denham. And the one who loved Catherine in the beginning, William Rodney, gets married with Cassandra. Cassandra was a cousin to Catherine. Night and Day was produced in 1919. And in 1922, she came out with her experimental novel, Jacob's Room. And it was the first novel published through the Hogarth Press. The novel centers around the life story of the protagonist, Jacob Flanders. And the story is presented entirely through the impressions of other characters on Jacob, mainly through the perspectives of two women, one belonging to the upper middle class, named Clara Durand, and the other is an art student named Florinda. And towards the end, Jacob travels to Italy, then to Greece, joins the war, and becomes dead. Jacob's Room was an experimental novel produced by Virginia Woolf in 1922. And 1922 seems to be a very important year for the publication of many modernist literary works, including T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, James Joyce's novel Ulysses, and D.H. Lawrence's novel Iron's Rods, and Carlos Williams' collection of poems called Spring and All, and Virginia's novel Jacob's Room. And then in 1925, Virginia came out with her novel Mrs. Dalloway. And Mrs. Dalloway was one of the characters introduced by Virginia in her first novel, Voyage Out. In the novel Voyage Out, Clarissa Dalloway is found traveling along with the characters in Voyage Out during their voyage. Clarissa Dalloway. And Clarissa Dalloway has been produced as character in a few of the stories by Virginia. Clarissa Dalloway is a link character of Virginia. In the novel Mrs. Dalloway, she has been produced as a lady of 51 years. And she belongs to the high society. The novel is created from two stories produced by Virginia. One, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, and the other unfinished story, The Prime Minister. The novel addresses Clarissa Dalloway's preparations for a party that she will host that evening. The central character, Clarissa Dalloway, is on her way to hold a party that evening. And when she returns home, an old suitor and friend named Peter Walsh drops in her house unexpectedly. Formerly, Clarissa was in love with Peter Walsh, but she refused to marry him. Now Peter Walsh visits Clarissa Dalloway and asks her whether she is happy with her husband Richard Dalloway. But before Clarissa can give an answer, her daughter Elizabeth, who is 17 years old, comes in. Anyhow, she invites Peter Walsh also to come and attend the party that she will hold in the evening. And in this novel, there is one more plot. And the hero of the plot is a war veteran named Septimus Warren Smith. He is a World War veteran, First World War veteran, who suffers from shell shock. Traumatic stress, he undergoes a traumatic stress of shell shock. And he has hallucinations of his dead friend named Evans, who died in the war. And he spends his day in the park with his Italian-born wife, Lucretia. And Peter Walsh, the one who visited the house of Clarissa Dalloway, watches Septimus Warren Smith and Lucretia sitting in the park. And Septimus Warren Smith has come to the town, in fact, to meet his psychiatrist. And when he meets the psychiatrist tells him that he should be put in a mental asylum, in a mental hospital, that he should have to treat his illness by staying in a mental asylum. And if he is to be put in the mental asylum, he will lose his freedom. His freedom of soul will be lost if he is put in the mental hospital and subjected through different medical treatments. And later in the day, Septimus Warren Smith jumps out from the window and commits suicide. He was really afraid that the doctor would destroy his soul. And when we come to the end of the story, we come to find that there are the people coming to attend the party held by Clarissa Dalloway. Peter Walsh attends Clarissa Dalloway's party along with the other characters in the novel. And she hears from Peter Walsh, Clarissa Dalloway hears from Peter Walsh about the suicide of Septimus Warren Smith. And Clarissa Dalloway feels admiration to the stranger's act. She identifies herself with Septimus. She considered the suicide as an attempt to preserve the purity of his happiness. When Septimus Warren Smith committed suicide, Clarissa Dalloway could not commit suicide. Even though she lost her freedom of soul, she could not commit suicide because she is committed to her husband and daughter. In the case of Septimus Warren Smith, he was not prepared to lose his freedom, therefore he committed suicide. And Clarissa Dalloway feels great admiration for Septimus Warren Smith. And in 1927, Virginia came out with her novel To the Lighthouse. And this is a stream of consciousness novel depicting the relationship of the members of Ramsay family. And in the novel there are 3 sections, beginning with the window, followed by time passes, and the last book is called The Lighthouse. Time also plays an important role in the novel. And when we find the plot of the first book, the window opens just before World War I. Mr. Ramsay, his wife, and their 8 children reach their summer home in the Hebrides, in the Scottish Hebrides. And Mrs. Ramsay tells her 6-year-old son, James, that they would visit the lighthouse the next day. They could see a lighthouse in the distance. And she told her 6-year-old son that they could visit the lighthouse the next day. But Mr. Ramsay asserts that the weather will not be clear for them to visit the lighthouse. And this creates tension between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. And this particular incident is referred to in the novel many times. And a number of friends also joined the family. And one of them is a young painter named Lily Briscoe, who has started to paint a portrait of Mrs. Ramsay and her son James. But she has some problems in